Rebel Moon Part 2 is directed by Zack Snyder and stars Sofia Boutella, Jumon Hansu, Ed Skrein, among others. I'm sorry if I can't get their names right. And in this story, it takes place after the events of the first Rebel Moon, where Korra and her crew end up returning to the planet of Velt, and they have to defend the world from the Mother World that their leader, Noble, is pretty much having to go after them and after being resurrected at the end of the last movie. Now, here's a little backstory. Now, this movie was directed by Zack Snyder, who I've gone on and leaned to in other videos, so there's not much to go on about. I've always admired him as a director, especially a lot of his early work, whether it's the remake of Dawn of the Dead, 300. I'm hit and miss depending on how you see with his other films, but I do like Batman vs Superman, especially the Ultimate Cut, and then also his version of Justice League. I also got a really enjoyed Army of the Dead. So the guy definitely has his share of good movies, but I can definitely tell that there's been some of his that I either haven't seen or from what I have seen, I haven't been the biggest fan of. Like from what I've watched, I really do love Watchmen, but I still need to finish it. And I've also enjoyed. Well, sorry, I did out of the movies I disliked. I didn't really care too much for Sucker Punch. But going into these movies, this was actually something that I was curious about. But at the same time, going from the last film, I wasn't really the biggest fan of because I was very disappointed with the first Rebel Moon, being that it was basically rehashed a lot of stuff that we've seen from Star Wars and a lot of other countless sci-fi films. And so going to this one, I had some very low expectations because it was one of those movies that I kind of figured it would probably have the same issues going into it like the first one did. And much to no surprise, I was actually right about a lot of things. And I'll be honest that while this movie is definitely a slight improvement of the last movie, I wouldn't go so far as to call it really necessarily a good movie. But it does have aspects in it that keep it from being bad compared to what I thought going into it. And so I'll give it that at least. But to get my pros out of the way, I thought the cast in this, like once again, they do good. Their performances are good, but there's aspects, especially with the writing, that I'll have to get to later because it really feels like there's a lot of stuff that's in the film that shows that there's not really a whole lot of dynamic to a lot of the majority of the characters. But for the most part, I do really enjoy Sofia Boutella. I thought she was really great again as Korra, and I really appreciate how they get to expand on some stuff with her backstory in this that I think was not only very compelling, but it also set things into gear, especially of something that will definitely trigger something in the future. I'm not going to spoil, but it certainly got me quite surprised in that regard. So she was great, and then I also really enjoyed Anthony Hopkins coming back voicing the robot Jimmy, as he's called, or James, and him getting to be able to finally do something in the movie was really cool and stuff. I'll leave it there because it really plays into the climax. So I thought that was great, and he was definitely one of the highlights. And I also really appreciate how they get to expand on some other ones, especially Jumon Hansu's character, who is basically the leader of the village, as the leader of the village this time, where he's trying to command all the villagers, trying to arm themselves and train them to prepare and everything. And I thought he was great, and I do appreciate that they get to explore more of his backstory in this that I thought really worked. And he was great. And then you do get to see some other backstories finally fleshed out with the rest of the mercenaries, but I'll get into my cons later with that because that is something I do have to criticize for as far as the structure of the film and also the way it plays out with its exposition. But I still at least appreciate that when we get into some of the backstories, that the ideas they set up with it do work in their own regard, and there's some stuff that really does pay off with some things that set forward later in the film. So that was great, and then there's some other, and on top of it, on a visual standpoint, once again, it really showcases a lot of the epic scope that Zack Snyder's going for with a lot of the CGI that he uses in a lot of the action scenes and stuff, and that can come hit and miss with some of the slow-mo, and some of it can be good, but I will have to admit that it gets into some stuff later where it's overused too much, because that's kind of what you expect with Zack Snyder. But I mean, for the most part, I didn't mind it. Just when it's done right in some of the action parts, it's great to see a lot of the cinematography is also great. The way that he was able to have that very bright kind of planet that he's on, that it takes place on, everything. And I also really appreciate how the movie does kick into gear, especially with the climax, where things go balls to the wall, and then they do have some unexpected stuff that happens later on that was actually giving me a smile toward it. And so it definitely got it redeemed itself toward the end with that final hour that it takes place. So there's that. But now this is kind of have to where I get into my cons. And as much as this movie does have some more entertaining aspects in this one that ups the stake, that ups it, the action department compared to the first movie, unfortunately it does get into some territory that's very familiar with the first one, where it's dealing with a lot of exposition dialogue, especially the same thing that happens where it opens with space, where you hear Anthony Hopkins explaining exposition that we've already known about, that I thought was very unnecessary, especially if you watch the first one. And with it also being in space again, that's also weird because you're just not even seeing the planets or anything at first. It just shows the stars. And it really seems like, I know that Snyder wasn't trying to copy Star Wars, but you could definitely tell that if you're not going to really get something really engaging on kind of exposition dialogue, you want to showcase it more. And while he does do that better in the flashback scenes that take place later, I do have to also feel like that was overdone, because the way that it played out, every time it gets to a flashback, it immediately goes from like 1 minute, 1.5 to 2 minutes of a flashback, then another flashback, and it keeps dragging on for almost like 5 to 10 minutes straight. And I get the intent that it was trying to get more fleshed out with some of the backstories with the characters, but it almost really feels unnecessary. It really feels like it's very padded out. And I think that kind of structure is something that I probably would have seen better if this was actually made into a limited TV series, where you get to expand on the characters for each episode and get to showcase their backstory and the stuff that leads up to the events. You know, make it a prequel like that. I think that right there would really make it its own right work a lot better, and really getting us to engage more with the characters. But with that also being said, one of the other things I noticed too is that this movie does really have a lot of convenient stuff that happens, especially things that is either where some of the stuff that they get into, especially with our main characters, easily surviving on certain stuff and get into things that make the stakes feel very low. And I'll leave it there, but it mainly has to do with like our lead pretty much not really getting much like vulnerability for the most part. And on top of that, one of the other things too I found really messy is the fact that when we get, once again, the characters in this don't really have much of a like camaraderie, because, you know, with this trying to be basically like them teaming up and everything, I was hoping they would at least, you know, try to at least throw in some more like banter at least between our mercenaries like together and stuff. I'm not saying you want to make it into any kind of comedy, but it really feels like they could have really done a lot more and really showed more of their personalities. And other than like showing their skills, which can be on a good like action level, that's all I really get for a lot of our characters, because they don't really stand out as really very three-dimensional, except for the three that I mentioned earlier, for the most part. Maybe not three-dimensional, but they at least have layers to them that I could still get behind. And so there's that. And then on top of that, I also had a problem with our villain coming back in this, and he's really just going through the same stuff that he did in the first film, and it really feels like there's really nothing really to him that really sticks out in a good way. But other than that, though, I mean, there's more I can go into detail, but it would have to involve some spoilers. This is definitely one that I could see a lot of the people that have criticized, because I don't really know if this is going to set up for future sequels or anything. We'll see how it goes, but I mean, I will say that I was still entertained by the time when it gets to like its last hour, despite some issues I also had with it. And with that, I'm going to give the movie just a very low, extremely low average Joe on the Film Freaks meter. And from what I also heard, this one is also going to have a director's cut like the first one, so I'll see how that goes. But for now, just going on the version that we have, this was a slight improvement, but still has a lot of issues and very similar stuff from the first one. And so, for those of you who have also seen Rebel Moon Part 2 and also the first one, let me know in the comments what you thought about it. And thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in my next review. I'll see you later.